There is a temple on the west bank of the Nile, carved into the base of a towering limestone cliff that looks like nothing else in Egypt. It has no pylons. It has no colossal statues flanking the entrance. It has no massive walls covered in battle scenes. Instead, it rises in 3 broad terraces, each one set back from the last, connected by long ramps that ascend the cliff face in a progression so elegant, so proportional, so perfectly calibrated to the landscape that it appears not to have been built at all, but to have grown from the rock itself. The temple merges with the mountain behind it. The columns merge with the cliff. The horizontal lines of the terraces echo the horizontal strata of the limestone. The vertical lines of the pillars echo the vertical cracks in the rock face. Architecture and geology are fused into a single composition, the most harmonious relationship between building and landscape in the entire history of Egyptian architecture. This is Djeseru, Holy of Holies, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh. And the story it tells is not merely a story about architecture. It is a story about power, about gender, about erasure, about a woman who claimed the throne of Egypt, ruled for 20 years, built one of the most extraordinary buildings in the ancient world, and then had her name and image systematically destroyed by the stepson she had raised. A destruction so thorough that her existence was forgotten for 3,000 years. The temple was designed by a man named Senenmut, Hatshepsut's chief steward, her daughter's tutor, and possibly her lover. The construction took roughly 15 years, beginning around 1479 BC. The site was chosen with deliberation, a natural amphitheatre of limestone cliffs on the western bank of the Nile at Thebes, directly across the river from the great temples of Karnak and Luxor. The amphitheatre faces east, toward the rising sun. The cliffs rise 300 meters above the valley floor, and at the base of these cliffs, where the desert meets the rock, Senenmut created a building that would serve simultaneously as a temple to the god Amun, a chapel to the goddess Hathor, a memorial to Hatshepsut's divine birth, a record of her greatest achievement, the expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, and a guarantee that her name would be spoken for eternity. The guarantee failed. After Hatshepsut's death around 1458 BC, her stepson and co-ruler Thutmose III, one of the greatest military pharaohs in Egyptian history, ordered her images chiseled from the temple walls, her statues smashed and buried, her name erased from every cartouche. The destruction was not immediate. It may not have begun until 20 or more years after her death, and it was not complete. Fragments survived, traces remained, but the intention was clear: to remove Hatshepsut from history, to close the gap she had opened in the normal succession, to restore the narrative of unbroken male kingship that her reign had disrupted. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand how a woman seized the most powerful throne in the ancient world, why she built the most beautiful temple in Egypt to justify that seizure, what the temple's walls reveal about the lengths she went to in order to legitimize her unprecedented rule, and why the destruction that followed her death tells us as much about the politics of memory as the temple itself tells us about the politics of power. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Hatshepsut's temple, you must first understand the woman who built it and the crisis that brought her to power. Hatshepsut was born around 1507 BC, the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his great royal wife, Amos. Her bloodline was impeccable. Her father was one of the most successful military pharaohs of the early 18th dynasty, and her mother may have been of direct royal descent, linking the family to the rulers who had expelled the Hyksos invaders and reunified Egypt. Hatshepsut was raised in the palace at Thebes, educated in the traditions of the court, and groomed for the role that royal women of the 18th dynasty were expected to play, not as rulers, but as the vessels through which divine royal blood was transmitted from one generation to the next. She married her half-brother, Thutmose II, a common practice in Egyptian royal families, designed to keep the divine bloodline concentrated within the ruling house. Thutmose II was not a well man. His mummy, when examined, showed signs of a skin disease and generally poor health. His reign was brief, perhaps 15 years, perhaps fewer. He died young, leaving behind a son, Thutmose III, born not to Hatshepsut but to a secondary wife named Isis. The boy was a child, too young to rule. And Hatshepsut, as the great royal wife, the king's daughter, and the most senior member of the royal family, stepped forward as regent. What happened next was extraordinary. Within the first 7 years of the regency, Hatshepsut transformed herself from regent to pharaoh. She did not merely govern on behalf of her stepson. She claimed the full titles, the full regalia, and the full divine status of a ruling king. She adopted the royal titulary, the 5 great names that identified a pharaoh as the legitimate ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. She wore the Nemes headdress. She wore the false beard. She was depicted in official art in the pose and the proportions of a male king, standing, striding, offering to the gods, smiting enemies. The transformation was total. By the 7th year of her regency, Hatshepsut was not a queen regent. She was a king. The reasons for this transformation are debated. Some scholars argue that it was driven by political necessity, that the boy king's youth created a power vacuum that Hatshepsut filled because no one else could. Others argue that it was driven by personal ambition, that Hatshepsut seized the throne because she wanted power and because her royal bloodline gave her a plausible claim. Still others argue that it was driven by theological logic, that the concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order, required a strong and active pharaoh, and that Hatshepsut, as the most capable member of the royal family, was the obvious choice to fulfill that role. Whatever the motivation, the consequence was clear. Hatshepsut needed to legitimize her unprecedented position. A female pharaoh was not merely unusual in Egypt, it was theologically problematic. The pharaoh was the living Horus, the falcon god, a male deity. The pharaoh was the son of Ra, the sun god, a male deity. The pharaoh was depicted performing male rituals, the Sed festival, the ritual of smiting enemies, the presentation of offerings. The entire theological apparatus of Egyptian kingship was designed for a male occupant. Hatshepsut, by claiming the throne, was not merely breaking a political convention, she was disrupting a cosmic order. And the temple at Deir el-Bahari was her answer. It was the architectural instrument through which she resolved the theological contradiction of her rule. It was the place where she explained, in carved and painted stone, why a woman could be a pharaoh, why her rule was not a disruption of Ma'at but a fulfillment of it, why the gods themselves had ordained her kingship, why her divine birth entitled her to the throne as much as any man. The site she chose was not empty. The natural amphitheatre at Deir el-Bahari already contained a mortuary temple, the Temple of Mentuhotep II, the 11th dynasty pharaoh who had reunified Egypt at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, roughly 500 years before Hatshepsut. Mentuhotep's temple was itself an innovative structure, a terraced building, rising in stages against the cliff face, with a central core that may have been topped by a small pyramid. By choosing to build beside Mentuhotep's temple, Hatshepsut was making a deliberate political statement. She was aligning herself with the pharaoh who had previously reunified Egypt, claiming his legacy, appropriating his prestige, placing her own monument in dialogue with his. Senenmut, the architect, took the basic concept of Mentuhotep's terraced design and transformed it. Where Mentuhotep's temple was solid and compact, Hatshepsut's was open and expansive. Where Mentuhotep's used heavy masonry and limited colonnade, Hatshepsut's used slender columns and broad ramps that opened the building to the landscape. The 3 terraces, lower, middle, and upper, rise in progressive steps, each one set back from the last, creating a visual rhythm that ascends the cliff face with a grace that is, by the standards of Egyptian architecture, revolutionary. The temple measures roughly 273 meters in length and 105 meters in width. The upper terrace reaches a height of approximately 29.5 meters above the valley floor. Each terrace is fronted by a colonnade, a row of square or proto-Doric pillars supporting a stone roof that creates a covered walkway along the front of each level. The ramps that connect the terraces are broad and gentle, designed not for speed but for procession, for the slow, dignified ascent of priests carrying sacred barks and ritual equipment. The temple is oriented on an east-west axis, with the entrance facing east. toward the Nile, toward the temples of Karnak and Luxor on the opposite bank, and toward the rising sun. The axis extends westward, through the terraces, through the upper colonnade, and into the cliff itself, where the sanctuary of Amun is carved into the living rock. The axis aligns with the midwinter sunrise, the moment when the sun, at its lowest point in the annual cycle, sends its first rays directly into the sanctuary. This solar alignment, similar in concept to the one at Abu Simbel but subtler in execution, connects the temple to the cosmic cycle of death and rebirth that governed Egyptian funerary theology. The temple faces the sunrise because the deceased pharaoh, like the sun, is reborn each morning. But the temple was not merely a mortuary monument, it was also a functioning cult center. A place where priests performed daily rituals, where festivals were celebrated, and where the living king could commune with the gods. The complex included shrines to Hathor, Anubis, and Amun-Ra, each one decorated with reliefs and statuary appropriate to its deity. The Hathor shrine, on the southern end of the middle terrace, featured columns with Hathor-headed capitals. The cow-eared face of the goddess, repeated on all four sides of each column, creating a forest of divine faces that greeted anyone who entered the chapel. The Anubis shrine, on the northern end, was decorated with vivid painted reliefs that retain their colours to this day, some of the best preserved painted surfaces in the entire Theban necropolis. And the middle terrace contained the two most famous decorative programs in the entire temple, the two sequences of reliefs that, more than any other element, defined Hatshepsut's claim to the throne and secured her place in the historical record. The birth colonnade, on the northern side, depicted Hatshepsut's divine conception and birth, the theological narrative that justified her rule, by claiming that she was not merely the daughter of a human king, but the biological offspring of the god Amun himself. The Punt colonnade, on the southern side, depicted the most ambitious trade expedition of the 18th dynasty. The journey to the legendary land of Punt, from which Hatshepsut's ships returned laden with myrrh trees, incense, gold, ivory, and exotic animals. These two programs, the Divine Birth and the Punt expedition, were the twin pillars of Hatshepsut's legitimacy. The birth narrative established her divine parentage. The Punt narrative established her practical competence. Together, they answered the two questions that any skeptic might ask about a female pharaoh. By what right do you rule, and what have you accomplished? The birth narrative answered the first question, I rule because God is my father. The Punt narrative answered the second, I have accomplished what no pharaoh before me has achieved, the reopening of the ancient trade routes, the restoration of Egypt's connection to the fabled land of incense, the enrichment of the Temple of Amun with treasures from the ends of the earth. The Punt reliefs are among the most extraordinary documentary records in Egyptian art. They depict the entire expedition in sequential panels, the departure of 5 ships from an Egyptian port, the voyage along the Red Sea coast, the arrival at Punt, the reception by the Puntite king Parahu and his queen Ati, the trading of goods, the loading of the ships with myrrh trees and exotic cargo, and the triumphant return to Egypt. The reliefs are detailed enough to identify individual species of trees, animals, and fish. The Puntite Queen Ati is depicted with an unusual body type, heavy, with rolls of fat on her arms and legs. That has been the subject of scholarly debate. Some have interpreted her appearance as evidence of a medical condition. Others have suggested it was a stylistic convention indicating wealth and status. Whatever the explanation, the depiction is striking, vivid, specific, humanizing in a way that most Egyptian relief art is not. The myrrh trees, 31 of them, according to the inscriptions, were the expedition's most prized cargo. They were living trees, uprooted in Punt, and transported in baskets back to Egypt, where Hatshepsut had them planted in the terraces of her temple at Deir el-Bahari. The tree pits are still visible in the forecourt, shallow depressions in the rock, filled with imported soil, arranged in rows along the approach to the temple. They are the oldest known evidence of a deliberate botanical transplantation, a pharaoh bringing foreign trees across the sea and planting them in her own garden. The myrrh trees would have perfumed the temple with their resin, the same incense that was burned in the daily rituals. the same fragrance that accompanied the prayers of the priests, the same scent that Amun himself was said to favor above all others. The trees are gone now. They died centuries ago, but the pits remain, and the reliefs that depict their transportation remain, and the inscription that records their planting remains. Come back with us, O tree of myrrh, to the house of Amun, so that Matkare may plant you in his garden. Matkare, Hatshepsut's throne name, the name she chose for herself, the name that means truth is the Ka of Ra, the name that her stepson would later try to erase from every surface in Egypt. The architectural innovation of Djeser cannot be overstated. Before Hatshepsut, Egyptian mortuary temples followed a standard plan, an enclosed rectangular compound, surrounded by high walls, dominated by a massive pylon gateway, with the sanctuary located in the deepest and darkest recess of the building. Mentuhotep II's nearby temple had begun to experiment with a different approach, using terraces and colonnades to create a more open, landscape-integrated design. But Senenmut took this experiment and pushed it to its logical conclusion. He created a building that was more terrace than temple, more colonnade than enclosure, more ramp than corridor. He replaced the heavy fortress-like architecture of the traditional mortuary temple with something lighter, more open, more responsive to the natural setting. The result was a building that, when seen from the valley below, appears to emerge from the cliff face like a geological formation. The horizontal lines of the terraces parallel the horizontal strata of limestone. The vertical lines of the columns echo the vertical cracks and fissures in the rock. The colour of the sandstone masonry matches the colour of the natural cliff behind it. The building and the cliff are the same colour, the same texture, the same material, separated only by the precision of the carving that distinguishes the man-made from the natural. This integration was not accidental. It was a deliberate design strategy, executed with extraordinary precision. The terraces were positioned at heights that corresponded to natural ledges in the cliff face. The colonnades were proportioned to echo the visual rhythm of the rock strata. The ramps were angled to follow the natural slope of the talus, the pile of fallen debris at the base of the cliff. Every element of the design was calibrated to the landscape, and the landscape, in turn, was treated not as a backdrop, but as a partner, an active participant in the architectural composition, as essential to the building's visual effect as the columns and the walls. Modern architects have struggled to replicate this kind of landscape integration. Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater, built over a waterfall in rural Pennsylvania in 1935, is often cited as the supreme example of architecture integrated with its natural setting. But Fallingwater is a house. Djeser is a temple, a building of vastly greater scale, complexity, and cultural significance. And the integration at Deir el-Bahari is arguably more successful. The temple does not merely sit beside the landscape, as Fallingwater sits beside its waterfall. It becomes the landscape. It is indistinguishable from the cliff at a distance. It reveals itself only gradually as the viewer approaches, resolving from a series of horizontal lines in the rock face into a building of extraordinary refinement and detail. The construction techniques used at Deir el-Bahari were those standard to New Kingdom temple building, but applied with exceptional care. The limestone blocks were quarried locally, from the surrounding hills and from older structures that Senenmut cannibalized for material. The blocks were cut, transported on sledges, and fitted into place using copper tools, wooden levers, and the skilled labor of teams of masons whose names, in a few cases, have been preserved in graffiti found at the construction site. The painted decoration of the temple was extensive. Every surface, every column, every wall, every ceiling, every doorway was originally covered with painted relief. The colours were vibrant: reds, blues, yellows, greens, and whites applied to a thin layer of plaster over the carved sandstone surface. The painting was done by specialist artists who worked from detailed preliminary drawings, red-line sketches that were first laid out on the prepared surface and then corrected by a master draftsman before the final outlines were carved and the colour was applied. In the Hathor Chapel and the Anubis Chapel, significant amounts of the original painted decoration have survived, protected by the darkness of the rock-cut interior and by the accumulation of debris that sealed the chambers for centuries. These painted surfaces are among the finest examples of 18th dynasty art, detailed, colourful, and executed with a precision that reflects the highest standards of the royal workshops. The colours in the Anubis chapel, in particular, are strikingly well preserved. The blue of the sky, the red of the god's shrine, the yellow of the offerings, all still vivid after 34 centuries. The Polish-Egyptian Archaeological and Conservation Mission, which has been the primary custodian of the site since 1961, has conducted exhaustive documentation and conservation of these painted surfaces. Their work has included photographic documentation, chemical analysis of the pigments, and careful consolidation of the plaster layers that hold the paint to the stone. The mission's publications, spanning more than 6 decades of continuous work, constitute the most comprehensive scientific record of any single temple in Egypt. The mission has also made significant discoveries. In the course of cleaning and restoring the upper terrace, the Polish team discovered that the original colour scheme of the Osirid statues included not just the standard reds and whites of pharaonic art, but also a striking blue, a lapis lazuli blue, applied to the faces of the Osirid figures that gave them an otherworldly, divine appearance. This discovery transformed scholarly understanding of the temple's visual program. The Osirid statues were not merely representations of the deceased pharaoh. They were representations of a transfigured, divine being, a king who had passed through death and emerged as a god, their blue faces marking their transition from the human to the divine. The discovery of the blue-faced Osirid statues is a perfect example of how conservation work can generate new knowledge. Before the Polish mission cleaned the fragments and identified the pigment traces, no one knew that the statues had been painted blue. The information was there, in the pigment residue, in the chemical composition of the plaster, in the colour traces that were visible only under ultraviolet light or under magnification, but it was invisible to the naked eye, hidden beneath centuries of accumulated dust and surface discoloration. The conservation process, the slow, patient, meticulous work of cleaning and documenting ancient surfaces, revealed information that the original builders had intended to be visible but that time had hidden. This is what conservation does at its best. It does not merely preserve the physical fabric of a monument. It recovers information that was lost, not destroyed, but hidden, buried beneath the accumulated patina of centuries. The temple at Deir el-Bahari contains more information than any visitor can see. The painted surfaces hold information in their pigments. The carved surfaces hold information in their tool marks. The construction joints hold information in their alignment. And the conservation teams, the Polish mission, the Egyptian authorities, the international scholars who study the site, are engaged in the ongoing project of extracting this information, layer by layer, surface by surface, pigment by pigment. The project is not finished. It may never be finished. But each season of work adds to the total. Each clean surface, each documented pigment, each published photograph adds a piece to the mosaic of knowledge that the temple contains. And the mosaic, when assembled, tells a story that is richer, more detailed, and more human than any single inscription could convey. The story of a woman who became king. The story of an architect who loved her. The story of a temple that survived the destruction of its builder's name. And the story of the scholars who, 3,400 years later, are still reading the walls. Senenmut's design for Djeser Djeseru has been the subject of extensive architectural analysis, and several scholars have proposed that the temple's proportions are based on a mathematical system, a modular grid that governed the placement of columns, the width of ramps, the height of terraces, and the overall dimensions of the building. The evidence for such a system is circumstantial. The proportions are strikingly regular. The measurements repeat in patterns that suggest deliberate calculation, and the overall composition has a mathematical harmony that is difficult to attribute to chance. But the specific mathematical system has not been identified with certainty, and the question of whether the Egyptians used formal geometric systems in their architectural design as opposed to empirical rules of thumb remains open. What is not in question is the aesthetic result. Djeser Djeseru is beautiful. It is beautiful in the way that a mathematical theorem is beautiful, elegant, necessary, complete. Every element serves a purpose. Every proportion is justified. Every relationship between part and whole is resolved. There is no waste. There is no excess. There is only the building, the cliff, the sunrise, and the proportions that bind them together into something that, after 34 centuries, still takes the breath away. And that beauty, that architectural beauty, that mathematical beauty, that beauty of proportion and placement and landscape integration, is what survived the erasure. Thutmose III could erase the name. He could smash the statues. He could chisel the cartouches. But he could not touch the proportions. He could not alter the relationship between terrace and cliff. He could not change the angle of the ramp, or the height of the colonnade, or the width of the court. The beauty was embedded in the architecture, and the architecture was embedded in the landscape, and the landscape was embedded in the geology of the earth itself. The erasure could reach the surface. It could not reach the structure. And the structure, 3,400 years later, is still standing. The core problem of the Temple of Hatshepsut is the problem of erasure and the paradox that erasure creates. After Hatshepsut died, around 1458 BC, Thutmose III, the stepson she had sidelined for 20 years, became sole pharaoh. He ruled for another 32 years. He fought 17 military campaigns. He conquered more territory than any pharaoh before him. He expanded the empire from the Euphrates to the Fourth Cataract. He built extensively at Karnak. He was, by any measure, one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history. And at some point during his sole reign, scholars disagree on when, but the most recent analysis by Peter Dorman suggests it may have been as late as the last decade of Thutmose's life, roughly 20 years after Hatshepsut's death. He ordered the systematic removal of Hatshepsut's name and image from her monuments. The destruction was methodical. At Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut's cartouches were chiseled from the walls. Her images were hacked away. Her statues, more than 200 of them, ranging from small seated figures to colossal Osirid statues that stood in the upper colonnade, were smashed and thrown into pits near the temple. The fragments, discovered by the Metropolitan Museum of Art's expedition in the 1920s and 30s, were so numerous that the museum was able to reconstruct several complete statues, including a magnificent seated figure of Hatshepsut in white limestone and a kneeling figure offering 2 vases of wine. These reconstructed statues, now on display in the Met, are among the masterpieces of 18th dynasty art, and they survive only because Thutmose's workers, having smashed them, did not bother to grind the fragments to dust. But here's the problem. The erasure was not consistent. Some of Hatshepsut's images were removed, others were left intact. Some of her cartouches were replaced with those of Thutmose I, her father, or Thutmose II, her husband. Others were left untouched. The Punt reliefs, which depicted Hatshepsut's greatest achievement, were damaged but not destroyed. The divine birth narrative, which was the theological foundation of her rule, was similarly defaced but not obliterated. The destruction was selective, targeted, precise, and in many cases incomplete. This selectivity has puzzled scholars for decades. If Thutmose III wanted to erase Hatshepsut from history, why didn't he do a thorough job? Why leave fragments? Why spare certain images while destroying others? The most recent scholarship, led by Dorman and others, has proposed an answer that transforms our understanding of the entire episode. The erasure, they argue, was not an act of personal revenge. It was not motivated by hatred of Hatshepsut or by anger at her usurpation of the throne. It was motivated by something more calculated and more political, the need to regularize the succession. Hatshepsut's reign had created a problem for the official record. She had been depicted as a king, a male king, with the full royal titulary, but she was a woman. Her reign, however successful, was theologically anomalous, and the anomaly created a gap in the succession that Thutmose, or his advisors, wanted to close. By replacing Hatshepsut's cartouches with those of Thutmose I and Thutmose II, the erasure did not eliminate a pharaoh from the record. It reassigned her monuments to her male predecessors, creating a seamless sequence of male kings, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, in which the anomalous female reign simply did not appear. The erasure was not personal, it was institutional. It was a bureaucratic correction to the dynastic record, an act of administrative tidiness rather than personal vendetta. And it gets worse. The 20-year delay that Dorman identified between Hatshepsut's death and the beginning of the erasure is itself significant. If Thutmose had hated Hatshepsut, if the erasure had been motivated by personal rage, it would have begun immediately after her death. But it did not. It began decades later, possibly in connection with Thutmose's preparations for his own succession. He was elderly by then. His son, Amenhotep II, was being groomed for the throne, and the existence of a female pharaoh in the recent dynastic record, a precedent that might be cited by future queens seeking to seize power, was a political risk that Thutmose's advisors may have wanted to eliminate. The erasure in this reading was a precautionary measure, not directed against Hatshepsut personally, but against the precedent she had set. This interpretation, while widely accepted in current scholarship, remains debated. Some scholars continue to argue for a personal motive, pointing to the thoroughness of the statue destruction as evidence of genuine hostility. Others propose a religious motive, arguing that the erasure was connected to a theological reform that sought to redefine the relationship between male and female kingship. The truth may combine elements of all three explanations. Motivations in the ancient world, as in the modern, were rarely singular. But here is what makes the erasure most fascinating from an archaeological perspective. It failed. Hatshepsut was not erased from history. Her name was removed from many monuments, but it survived on others. Her cartouches were chiseled from the temple walls, but the outlines of the chiseling are themselves readable. An Egyptologist can see where a name was removed, even when the name itself is gone. Her statues were smashed, but the fragments were not destroyed. They were buried in pits within the temple compound, where they were preserved by the same sand that preserved so much else at Thebes. And the temple itself, the building that was supposed to be her greatest monument and that the erasure was supposed to neutralize, survived intact. The architecture was not touched. The terraces still rise. The columns still stand. The cliff still frames the building. Everything that makes Djeser extraordinary. Its proportions, its setting, its relationship to the landscape was left untouched by the erasure, because those qualities belong to the building, not to the name on the wall. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how memory works. We assume that names are memory, that to erase a name is to erase a person, that the cartouche is the identity. The Temple of Hatshepsut proves otherwise. The name was erased, the building survived. And the building, 3 terraces, rising against a cliff, 273 meters of proportioned stone, is a more powerful memorial than any cartouche could ever be. Hatshepsut's name was taken from her, but her temple was not, and the temple, in the end, was enough. The rediscovery of Hatshepsut as a historical figure is itself a remarkable story. For centuries, Egyptologists knew the temple at Deir el-Bahari but did not know who had built it. The erasure had been so effective that the temple was attributed to Thutmose III, or to a vague sequence of 18th dynasty kings, until the mid-19th century, when careful reading of the surviving inscriptions, including those that the erasure had missed, revealed the name of the true builder. The revelation was astonishing. A woman had built one of the finest temples in Egypt. A woman had ruled as pharaoh for 20 years. A woman had sent a fleet to the ends of the earth, and her story had been deliberately suppressed by her own successor, hidden for 34 centuries beneath a layer of chiseled stone. The archaeological reconstruction of Hatshepsut's reign, the recovery of her name, her titles, her achievements, her building program, is one of the great detective stories of Egyptology. It involved the painstaking comparison of inscriptions from multiple sites, the reassembly of smashed statues from thousands of fragments, the decipherment of palimpsest walls where new names had been carved over old ones, and the integration of evidence from Deir el-Bahari, Karnak, the Sinai, and Beni Hassan into a coherent narrative of a reign that had been deliberately obscured. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's work at Deir el-Bahari, which began in 1911 and continued for decades, was central to this reconstruction. The museum's expedition, led by Herbert Winlock and later by other scholars, excavated the temple forecourt, the lower and middle terraces, and the pits where Hatshepsut's smashed statuary had been dumped. The discovery in 1926 and 1927 of masses of broken statues in the quarry pit near the Mentuhotep Causeway was a pivotal moment. The fragments were so numerous and their quality so high that the museum was able to reconstruct more than a dozen major statues and dozens of smaller ones. An entire gallery of Hatshepsut's art recovered from destruction, reassembled from rubble, and the Polish-Egyptian Archaeological and Conservation Mission, which has been working at Deir el-Bahari since 1961, has continued the work of excavation, documentation, and restoration that the Metropolitan Museum began. The Polish mission, under the direction of a succession of distinguished archaeologists, has restored significant portions of the temple, including the upper terrace, the Hathor Chapel, and the Anubis Chapel. Their work has revealed details of the temple's painted decoration that were invisible before restoration, colors, patterns, and scenes that had been hidden beneath centuries of accumulated dust and debris. The temple that visitors see today is in significant measure the result of more than 6 decades of Polish conservation work, a partnership between modern archaeological science and ancient Egyptian art that has returned Djeser to something approaching its original splendor. The Punt expedition, documented on the walls of the middle terrace, was not merely a trading mission, it was a statement of imperial ambition, a demonstration that Egypt's reach extended beyond the Nile Valley, beyond the borders of the traditional two lands, to the exotic shores of a distant country that most Egyptians would never see. The expedition involved 5 ships, each carrying roughly 30 crew members, plus soldiers, interpreters, and trade goods. The ships sailed from an Egyptian port on the Red Sea coast, probably Mersa Gawasis, where recent archaeological excavations have uncovered storage caves, rope coils, and ceramic fragments associated with maritime expeditions, and travelled south along the Red Sea coast to reach Punt, which most scholars now locate in the region of modern Eritrea or the adjacent coast of Ethiopia or Somalia. The journey was dangerous. The Red Sea is one of the most treacherous bodies of water in the ancient world. Shallow reefs, unpredictable winds, and extreme heat made navigation hazardous, even for experienced sailors. The Egyptian ships were not ocean-going vessels in the modern sense. They were adapted Nile boats, wooden craft designed for river navigation, modified for coastal sailing, with reinforced hulls and additional rigging. The voyage to Punt and back would have taken several months, and the risks, shipwreck, disease, hostile encounters, were substantial. Hatshepsut presented the expedition as divinely ordained. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show the god Amun commanding the expedition, the divine oracle directing the ships to Punt, and the god expressing satisfaction with the cargo upon its return. The framing is theological, not commercial. The expedition was an act of piety, not of profit. The myrrh trees were not trade goods. They were offerings, living gifts from the ends of the earth, transported at enormous expense and risk, to be planted in the garden of the god. But the expedition was also, undeniably, a political achievement. Previous Egyptian expeditions to Punt had been organized by earlier pharaohs. Sahur of the 5th dynasty, Mentuhotep III of the 11th dynasty, Amenhotep I of the 18th dynasty. But none had been documented with the detail and the visual ambition of Hatshepsut's Punt reliefs. By recording the expedition in such comprehensive detail, showing the ships, the crew, the trade goods, the foreign rulers, the exotic animals, the myrrh trees, Hatshepsut was claiming an achievement that would be visible to every priest, every official, and every visitor who entered her temple. She was saying, "I did this. I sent ships to the ends of the earth. I brought back the treasures of Punt, and I did it not as a queen regent or a female consort, but as pharaoh, as the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, ruling in the name of Amun, fulfilling the god's command." The Punt reliefs are documentary art at its finest. They depict specific individuals, the Puntite king Parahu, his wife Ati, their children, with an attention to physiognomic detail that is unusual in Egyptian art. The Puntite houses, built on stilts above the ground, are depicted with their characteristic conical roofs and their laddered entrances. The Puntite vegetation, including identifiable species of trees and plants, is rendered with botanical precision. The trade goods, myrrh, frankincense, ebony, gold, ivory, animal skins, live baboons, are catalogued with an accountant's thoroughness. The reliefs are simultaneously a work of art, a diplomatic record, a commercial inventory, and a scientific document, a combination that has no parallel in the art of the ancient world. The myrrh trees that were brought back from Punt and planted in the temple forecourt were not merely decorative, they were functional. The resin of the myrrh tree, when burned, produced the sacred incense that was used in the daily temple rituals. By planting the trees in her own temple, Hatshepsut was creating a self-sustaining supply of incense, an agricultural endowment that would provide for the temple's ritual needs in perpetuity, without depending on further expeditions or external trade. The trees were, in modern terms, a revenue-generating asset, a permanent investment in the temple's operational capacity. The concept of planting imported trees in a temple precinct was innovative. No previous pharaoh had attempted a botanical transplantation of this kind, and the fact that the trees were brought from Punt, the legendary land of incense, the gods' land, the place where the gods themselves were said to dwell, gave the planting a theological dimension that transcended its practical utility. The trees were not merely incense producers. They were sacred objects, living links between the temple and the land of the gods, botanical ambassadors from the divine realm, rooted in Egyptian soil, but originating in the soil of the sacred. The trees are gone. The soil has been baked by the sun. The pits are empty, their contours softened by 34 centuries of erosion. But the reliefs remain, showing the trees being carefully removed from Puntite soil, placed in baskets, carried aboard ships, transported across the sea, and planted in the terraces of Djeser. The reliefs are the record of an act of botanical imperialism. A pharaoh reaching across the known world to bring the treasures of the divine land to the garden of the god. And the record, carved in stone on the walls of the middle terrace, has outlasted the trees by 34 centuries and shows no sign of disappearing. The broader context of Hatshepsut's building program places Deir el-Bahari within a larger pattern of royal construction that extended across Egypt. Hatshepsut built or renovated temples at Karnak, where she erected 2 enormous obelisks in the hypostyle hall area, at Bu-En in Nubia, at Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt, at Pakhet in the Eastern Desert, and at several other sites. Her construction program was not the largest of the 18th dynasty. Thutmose III and Amenhotep III both built more extensively, but it was among the most architecturally innovative. The obelisks at Karnak were the tallest of their era. The Spios Artemidos temple at Beni Hassan was a rock-cut shrine of unusual design, and Deir el-Bahari was, and remains, the most architecturally distinctive temple in the Theban necropolis. The fact that Hatshepsut chose to invest so heavily in construction tells us something about her understanding of power. In the ancient Egyptian world, building was ruling. A pharaoh who did not build was a pharaoh who did not govern. The construction of temples, obelisks and monuments was not a hobby or a luxury. It was an obligation, a duty that the pharaoh owed to the gods and that the gods expected to be fulfilled. Hatshepsut, who was already fighting an uphill battle for legitimacy because of her gender, could not afford to neglect this obligation. She built more and more ambitiously than many of her male predecessors because she had more to prove. The temple at Deir el-Bahari was not merely a mortuary monument, it was a credential, a 3-dimensional resume, a carved and painted argument that the woman who built it was worthy of the throne she occupied, and the argument succeeded for 20 years. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt without civil war, without invasion, without economic collapse. She maintained the empire. She expanded trade, she built temples, she honored the gods. She governed with a competence that many of her male successors could not match. And when she died, the temple that she had built to guarantee her eternal memory was, despite the subsequent erasure, the most eloquent testimony to her achievement. A building that said, without words, what no inscription could convey with sufficient force, that a woman had been king, and that she had been a good one. Walk through the temple as a visitor would. Approach from the east, across the broad causeway that originally connected the temple to a valley temple near the Nile. The valley temple is gone, destroyed by later construction and by the shifting course of the river. but the causeway, partially restored, still guides the visitor toward the first terrace, the lowest of the 3 levels. The lower terrace was originally flanked by 2 rows of myrrh trees, the living souvenirs of the Punt expedition, planted in specially prepared pits that are still visible in the bedrock. The trees would have perfumed the approach to the temple with the scent of incense, the sacred fragrance of Amun, the olfactory signature of the divine. Visitors today walk between the empty tree pits and must imagine the scent, but the pits themselves are eloquent. Physical evidence that Hatshepsut did not merely record the Punt expedition on the walls. She planted it in the ground. A ramp ascends from the lower terrace to the middle terrace. The ramp is broad and gentle, designed for ceremonial procession. On either side of the ramp, at its base, Hatshepsut originally placed colossal sphinxes, lion-bodied figures with her own face, that guarded the approach. The sphinxes were among the statues destroyed by Thutmose III. Fragments were found in the quarry pit. The middle terrace is the heart of the temple. It is here that the 2 great narrative programs, the Divine Birth and the Punt Expedition, are carved on the walls of the northern and southern colonnades. The Punt colonnade to the south is the more famous. The reliefs begin with the departure of the fleet, 5 ships, each with roughly 30 crewmen, setting sail from an Egyptian port that may have been located on the Red Sea coast. The ships are depicted in profile, their sails raised, their oars extended, their rigging rendered in precise detail. The voyage itself is not shown. The narrative jumps from departure to arrival, from Egypt to Punt, without depicting the sea journey between them. At Punt, the Egyptian delegation is received by the Puntite king Pharaoh and his wife Ati. The relief depicting Ati is one of the most discussed images in Egyptian art. The queen is shown with an unusually large body. Her belly is distended, her arms are heavy, her legs are thick. The depiction has been variously interpreted as evidence of elephantiasis, lipedema, the genetic condition known as Dercum's disease, or simply as a stylistic convention indicating wealth and status in Puntite culture. Whatever the explanation, the image is vivid, specific, and humanizing, a portrait of a real individual, rendered with an attention to physical detail that is rare in Egyptian monumental art. The trading scenes show the Egyptians offering manufactured goods, beads, weapons, tools, in exchange for the raw materials of Punt. Myrrh trees in baskets, mounds of incense, stacks of ebony, piles of gold, bundles of animal skins, and live animals including baboons, a giraffe, and dogs. The ships are then shown being loaded for the return voyage, their decks piled high with cargo, the myrrh trees carefully stowed in their baskets. The return to Egypt is triumphant. Hatshepsut is shown presenting the cargo of Punt to the god Amun, offering the myrrh, the incense, the gold, and the exotic goods to the deity who had commanded the expedition. The inscription records Amun's satisfaction. I have given thee all Punt. I have given thee all lands, all places in which thy heart rejoices. The expedition is presented not as a commercial venture, but as a sacred mission, a divine command, fulfilled by a faithful servant, rewarded by the god's pleasure. The birth colonnade, on the northern side of the middle terrace, tells an equally extraordinary story, the story of Hatshepsut's divine conception and birth. The reliefs depict a sequence of events that begins with a divine council in which Amun declares his intention to father a child who will rule Egypt. The god Thoth leads Amun to the bedchamber of Queen Ahmose, Hatshepsut's mother. Amun, disguised as the queen's husband, Thutmose I, enters the chamber. The queen recognizes the god by his fragrance. The inscription records the moment with characteristic Egyptian discretion. He went to her immediately. He had his way with her. The divine pregnancy follows. The creator god Khnum fashions the infant Hatshepsut and her car on his potter's wheel, as the goddess Heket looks on. The queen is led to the birth chamber by divine attendants. The birth is depicted with the mother seated on a block throne, supported by goddesses. The newborn is presented to Amun, who recognizes her as his child, and the infant is suckled by divine wet nurses, a visual metaphor for the transfer of divine sustenance from the gods to the human king. The narrative is not unique. Similar birth cycles were carved at Luxor Temple by Amenhotep III, but at Deir el-Bahari, the birth cycle carries a special urgency. Hatshepsut was not merely claiming divine parentage. She was defending an anomaly. She was a woman on a male throne. She needed divine sanction more than any conventional pharaoh. And the birth narrative, the claim that Amun himself had chosen her, that her existence was divinely ordained, that her gender was irrelevant because her father was a god, was the most powerful argument she could make. The upper terrace, the highest of the 3 levels, was the most sacred space in the temple. It was fronted by a colonnade of Osiris statues, figures of Hatshepsut in the pose of Osiris, arms crossed, holding the crook and flail, wearing the double crown. These statues, more than 20 of them, were the primary targets of Thutmose III's destruction. They were toppled, smashed, and dumped in pits. The fragments, when recovered, showed faces that were recognizably female, despite the male regalia, slightly narrower, slightly softer, with a delicacy of feature that distinguished them from the Osiris statues of male pharaohs. Behind the colonnade, the upper terrace contained the main sanctuary of Amun, a chapel carved into the cliff face, extending westward into the rock, its axis aligned with the midwinter sunrise. This solar alignment, connecting the temple to the cosmic cycle of the sun, was the theological engine of the building, the mechanism by which the deceased Hatshepsut would be reborn each morning with the rising sun. The sanctuary was shared with Thutmose I, Hatshepsut's father, whose cult she promoted alongside her own. By including her father's cult in the temple, Hatshepsut was not merely honoring a predecessor, she was reinforcing her own legitimacy. Her claim to the throne rested in part on her descent from Thutmose I. By placing his cult in the heart of her temple, she kept that claim visible, permanent, and architecturally inseparable from her own. The Hathor Chapel, on the southern end of the middle terrace, is one of the best preserved sections of the temple. The chapel extends into the cliff face through a series of chambers decorated with painted reliefs of extraordinary quality. The inner chamber features a carved image of the goddess Hathor as a cow, licking the hand of the pharaoh, a scene of divine nurture that is both theologically sophisticated and emotionally affecting. The colours in the Hathor Chapel are among the best preserved at Deir el-Bahari, vivid reds, blues, and yellows that glow in the dim interior light. The Anubis Chapel on the northern end is similarly well preserved. The painted reliefs show Hatshepsut and Thutmose III making offerings to the jackal-headed god of mummification. The fact that both Hatshepsut and Thutmose are depicted together in this chapel, side by side at equal scale, performing complementary rituals, is significant. It suggests that, at the time the chapel was decorated, the co-regency was functioning smoothly, with both rulers participating in the religious program of the temple. The erasure would come later, but the original decoration records a moment of apparent cooperation, a moment when the woman king and the boy king shared the sacred space of the Anubis Chapel without conflict. The temple complex also included subsidiary features that are often overlooked. A mortuary chapel for Hatshepsut and her father was carved into the cliff above the main sanctuary. An altar to the sun god Raharakti was positioned on the upper terrace to receive the sunrise, and a series of storerooms, workshops, and administrative spaces occupied the lower levels of the complex, providing the practical infrastructure that the temple's ritual program required. Senenmut, the architect, left his own mark on the temple, literally. In at least 60 locations within the complex, Senenmut carved small images of himself, in prayer, kneeling before the gods, in poses of devotion, hidden behind doors, beneath window sills, and in other inconspicuous locations where they would be invisible to casual visitors, but permanently present in the sacred space. These hidden images are an extraordinary act of personal ambition, a commoner inserting his own likeness into a royal temple, claiming a share of the sacred space for himself. Some scholars have interpreted them as evidence of Senenmut's intimate relationship with Hatshepsut, arguing that only a man who shared the queen's bed would dare to place his image in her temple. Others interpret them more conservatively, as an expression of the architect's professional pride and personal devotion. Senenmut also prepared 2 tombs for himself, TT 71, located on the hillside near the temple, and TT 353, a secret unfinished tomb beneath the temple's forecourt. TT 353 features the earliest known astronomical ceiling in Egypt, a painted star chart depicting constellations, planetary deities, and the lunar calendar. The ceiling is evidence that Senmut had an interest in astronomy, an interest that may have been applied to the design of the temple's solar alignment. The man who designed the temple's architecture may also have designed its cosmic program. Both of Senmut's tombs were damaged in antiquity. His name and images were defaced, possibly by the same campaign that targeted Hatshepsut. Senenmut disappears from the historical record around the 16th year of Hatshepsut's reign, and his fate is unknown. Did he fall from favour? Did he die? Was he punished for his relationship with the queen? The record is silent. Like Hatshepsut herself, Senenmut was subjected to the erasure that consumed the memory of the people who built Djeser-Djeseru. The relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III is one of the most debated topics in Egyptology, because it bears directly on the question of why the erasure occurred. The traditional narrative, popular in older scholarship, presented the relationship as adversarial. Hatshepsut as the wicked stepmother who seized the throne from the rightful heir, Thutmose as the resentful stepson who waited for decades to claim his revenge. This narrative, which owes more to fairy tales than to evidence, has been largely abandoned by modern scholarship. The evidence suggests a more complex and more interesting reality. Hatshepsut and Thutmose III appear to have ruled as co-regents for most of Hatshepsut's 20-year reign. Both are depicted together in temple scenes, performing complementary rituals, sharing the sacred space of the Anubis chapel at Deir el-Bahari. Thutmose was not imprisoned or sidelined during Hatshepsut's reign. He was active in military and religious affairs, and he may have commanded Egyptian forces in the field, while Hatshepsut managed domestic policy from Thebes. The co-regency was not harmonious in the way that modern democracies understand the term. There were certainly tensions, rivalries, and power struggles, but it was not the simple story of usurpation and revenge that older scholarship assumed. The erasure, when it came, may have been motivated not by personal hatred, but by dynastic calculation. Thutmose III was preparing the succession. His son, Amenhotep II, needed a clear and unambiguous claim to the throne. The existence of a female pharaoh in the recent dynastic record, a precedent that could be cited by future queens seeking to exercise royal power, was a potential complication that Thutmose wanted to eliminate. The erasure was not revenge, it was housekeeping. Political housekeeping, conducted on a monumental scale with chisels instead of pens. Peter Dorman's analysis of the timing of the erasure has been particularly influential. Dorman showed that the destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments did not begin immediately after her death, but was delayed by approximately 2 years, placing it in the last decade of Thutmose's reign, when the succession question was most urgent. This timing is inconsistent with a personal vendetta, which would have been executed promptly. It is consistent with a calculated political strategy, implemented when the political need arose. The erasure was not emotional, it was strategic. The statues of Hatshepsut that were smashed and buried at Deir el-Bahari provide the most vivid evidence of the destruction's extent. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's expedition, working in the 1920s and 30s under the direction of Herbert Winlock, discovered hundreds of statue fragments in pits near the temple and in the quarry area south of the Mentuhotep Causeway. The fragments represented every type of royal statue: seated figures, standing figures, Osirid figures, sphinxes, and kneeling figures presenting offerings. Many were made of fine white limestone or red granite, carved with exceptional skill and painted with vivid colours. The destruction had been systematic. The statues were not merely toppled but deliberately broken, with particular attention to the faces and the cartouches. Winlock's team, with remarkable patience and skill, reassembled several complete or nearly complete statues from the fragments. The most famous of these reconstructions, a life-sized kneeling figure of Hatshepsut offering 2 wine vases to the god Amun, is now one of the treasures of the Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian galleries. The figure is carved from white limestone, originally painted, with features that are unmistakably female despite the male royal regalia. The face is oval, the chin is pointed, the cheekbones are high. The expression is calm, confident, and slightly enigmatic. the face of a woman who claimed the power of a god and who expected to be believed. Other reconstructed statues show Hatshepsut in different aspects, as a seated pharaoh with a double crown, as a sphinx with a human face and a lion's body, as an osier-eyed figure with crossed arms and the crook and flail of kingship. Together, these statues constitute the most complete portrait gallery of any 18th dynasty ruler, a collection of images that reveals not just what Hatshepsut looked like, but how she chose to be. Represented how she negotiated the tension between her female body and her male office, how she used art to bridge the theological gap between who she was and what she claimed to be. The statues show a progression. In the earliest images, from the beginning of her reign, Hatshepsut is depicted with clearly female features, a slender waist, small breasts, a feminine face. In later images, the female characteristics are progressively suppressed. The waist broadens, the shoulders square, the face becomes more angular, the features approximate those of a male king. By the end of her reign, Hatshepsut's official images are virtually indistinguishable from those of a conventional male pharaoh. Only the occasional textual reference to His Majesty herself betrays the gender of the person depicted. This progressive masculinization of Hatshepsut's image is not evidence of deception. It is evidence of a deliberate artistic strategy, the gradual assimilation of the female ruler into the visual vocabulary of male kingship. Hatshepsut was not pretending to be a man. She was performing kingship, adopting the visual conventions that Egyptian theology required of a pharaoh, regardless of the pharaoh's biological sex. The statues at Deir el-Bahari are not portraits of a woman in disguise. They are portraits of a king who happened to be female and whose art reflects the tension between the two categories. The recovery of these statues and the reconstruction of this artistic program has transformed our understanding of Hatshepsut's reign. Before the Met's excavations, Hatshepsut was a name on a damaged wall, a vague presence, barely detectable, obscured by the erasure that her successor had imposed. After the excavations, she was a physical presence, visible, tangible, represented by dozens of works of art that revealed her face, her body, her regalia, her ambitions, and her artistic taste. The reconstruction of the statues was a reconstruction of the person. The fragments were assembled into a queen, and the queen, emerging from the rubble of her own destruction, proved to be one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history. The mummy question adds another layer to the story. For more than a century, the physical remains of Hatshepsut were unknown. Her tomb, KV-20, was discovered in the Valley of the Kings by Howard Carter in 1903, but it was found empty. The mummy had been removed in antiquity, probably during the Third Intermediate Period, when the royal mummies were relocated to secret caches to protect them from tomb robbers. In 2007, the Egyptologist Zahi Hawass announced the identification of a mummy, previously designated KV-60A, as the remains of Hatshepsut. The identification was based on a DNA comparison between the mummy and a molar tooth found in a canopic box inscribed with Hatshepsut's name. The tooth fit perfectly into a gap in the mummy's jaw. CT scanning revealed that the mummy was an obese woman who had died in her 50s, suffering from diabetes, cancer, and dental abscesses. The identification remains the subject of debate. Some scholars have questioned the methodology and the security of the DNA comparison, but it is widely, though not universally, accepted. If the identification is correct, then Hatshepsut died not in the prime of life but in decline, overweight, in pain, weakened by disease. The contrast between the vigorous, idealized king depicted on the temple walls and the ailing, corpulent woman whose mummy may have been found in the Valley of the Kings is a reminder that Egyptian art was not portraiture in the modern sense. It was theology, an idealized representation of the divine king, designed to serve the afterlife, not to record the physical reality of the mortal body. The temple and the mummy tell different stories about the same person. The temple tells the story that Hatshepsut wanted to be told, the story of a divinely born king, favored by the gods, successful in peace and trade, builder of the most beautiful temple in Egypt. The mummy tells the story that the body could not conceal, the story of a woman who lived hard, who aged badly, who suffered the ordinary indignities of a mortal existence, despite occupying the most exalted position in the ancient world. Together, the two stories compose a complete portrait, the public and the private, the divine and the human. the ideal and the real. The modern restoration of the temple by the Polish-Egyptian mission has been one of the longest continuous conservation projects in the history of archaeology. Beginning in 1961, under the direction of Professor Kazimierz Michalowski, the mission has been led by a succession of Polish archaeologists and conservators who have devoted their careers to the study and preservation of Jezu. The work has involved the excavation of previously unexcavated areas of the complex, the stabilization of structural elements that were in danger of collapse, the cleaning and consolidation of painted surfaces, and the reconstruction of architectural features from fragments recovered during excavation. The scale of the restoration is apparent to any visitor. The upper terrace, which was largely in ruins when the Polish mission began work, has been substantially reconstructed, its colonnades re-erected from fallen blocks, its Osiris statue niches cleared and stabilized, its sanctuary cleaned and documented. The Hathor Chapel, which had been filled with debris and partially collapsed, has been excavated, its painted surfaces cleaned and consolidated, its architectural elements repositioned. The Anubis Chapel, similarly treated, now displays some of the best preserved painted decoration in the entire Theban necropolis. The reconstruction process has required the Polish team to make difficult decisions about authenticity and intervention. When a fallen column can be re-erected from its original drums using original materials, the reconstruction is straightforward. The column is restored to its original position, and the result is, in every meaningful sense, the original column. But when fragments are missing, when blocks have been destroyed, or carried away for reuse in other structures, or ground to powder by millennia of erosion, the reconstruction requires the introduction of new material. The new blocks are carved from the same type of sandstone, shaped to match the originals, and positioned to fill the gaps in the original fabric. They are distinguished from the original blocks by subtle differences in color and texture, a convention that allows scholars and attentive visitors to distinguish the ancient from the modern without disrupting the visual harmony of the building. The ethical framework that governs this kind of restoration, the distinction between conservation, which preserves existing material, and reconstruction, which introduces new material, is the subject of ongoing debate in the heritage profession. The Venice Charter of 1964, which established the international standards for conservation practice, distinguishes sharply between the two, permitting conservation of existing fabric, but restricting reconstruction to cases where the evidence is unambiguous and the new material is clearly distinguishable from the old. The Polish mission at Deir el-Bahari has generally followed these principles, but the specific applications have varied over the decades. Earlier phases of the work were sometimes more interventionist than current practice would allow, while later phases have been more conservative. The result, visible to any visitor, is a temple that is part ancient and part modern, a composite structure in which original 18th dynasty blocks sit alongside 20th and 21st century replacements. Original painted surfaces survive alongside areas where the plaster has been cleaned and consolidated, but the color has been lost and original architectural forms have been reconstructed from a combination of surviving evidence and scholarly inference. The temple is not a pristine ancient monument. It is a palimpsest, a layered document in which ancient construction, ancient destruction, modern excavation, and modern restoration are all visible, all readable, all contributing to the meaning of the site. And the meaning of the site is, in the 21st century, more complex and more resonant than at any previous point in its history. Hatshepsut's temple is no longer merely an ancient Egyptian monument. It is a monument to the recovery of lost history, a building whose story includes not only the pharaoh who built it and the pharaoh who tried to destroy it, but the scholars who rediscovered it, the conservators who restored it, and the millions of visitors who have walked its ramps and climbed its terraces and stood before its reliefs and tried, across a gap of 34 centuries, to understand the woman who conceived it. The visitor's experience of Jezu is shaped by the approach. The temple is reached by a long, straight road that cuts across the flat valley floor from the modern Torquid office to the base of the first terrace. The road is lined on both sides by low walls, and the view ahead, the temple facade, framed by the towering cliff, growing in scale with every step, is one of the most carefully composed vistas in Egyptian archaeology. The approach was designed by Senenmut to produce exactly this effect, the gradual revelation of the temple's scale and beauty as the visitor approaches. The modern road follows the line of the ancient causeway, and the experience of the approach is, despite the presence of electric carts, security guards, and a modern visitor center, essentially the same experience that Hatshepsut's contemporaries would have had. The temple grows, the cliff rises, the columns multiply, and by the time the visitor reaches the base of the first ramp, the scale of the building, its width, its height, its relationship to the landscape, has been fully established. The temple does not surprise, it overwhelms, and the overwhelming is deliberate, designed, calculated, and architecturally precise. The lower terrace was originally planted with gardens, the myrrh trees from Punt plus native trees and flowering plants that would have created an oasis of green in the desert landscape. The tree pits are still visible, shallow depressions in the bedrock, filled with imported soil, arranged in a pattern that mirrors the symmetry of the colonnade behind. The gardens are gone. The trees died long ago, but the pits remain, archaeological evidence of a botanical program that accompanied the architectural one, that integrated living plants into the design of the temple, that used the fragrance of incense to create a sensory experience that complemented the visual experience of the architecture. The integration of gardens into the temple design is unusual in Egyptian architecture. Most temples were surrounded by bare stone courtyards, not by planted gardens. The presence of the gardens at Deir el-Bahari reflects Hatshepsut's particular relationship with the Land of Punt and with the god Amun, whose favorite offering was the incense produced from the myrrh tree. By planting the trees of Punt in the forecourt of her temple, Hatshepsut was creating a permanent offering, a garden that would produce incense for Amun in perpetuity, a living gift to the god, sustained by the soil and water of the Theban landscape. The gift outlasted the giver, but eventually the gift itself was lost. The trees died, the soil dried, the irrigation system that sustained the gardens failed when the temple cult was abandoned, and the forecourt, once a fragrant garden of incense trees, became a bare expanse of rock and sand. The only evidence of its former greenery, the shallow pits that once held the roots of trees brought from the other side of the sea. The loss of the gardens is one of the smaller losses at Deir el-Bahari, smaller than the loss of the statues, smaller than the loss of the painted surfaces, smaller than the loss of Hatshepsut's name from the temple walls. But it is, in its way, the most poignant, because the gardens were living. They were not stone or paint or carved inscription. They were trees, growing, breathing, flowering, producing the resin that was burned in the rituals and that filled the temple with the scent of the divine. The trees were the only part of the temple that was alive, and they were the first part to die. The stone endures, the paint fades, the name is erased and recovered. The trees die and leave only the pits that held their roots, and the visitor, walking between the empty pits, smells nothing, only the dry desert air, the faint tang of hot stone, the modern perfumes of the tourists who have come to see the temple of a woman who planted a garden of incense at the foot of a cliff 3,400 years ago for a god who no longer lives there. The deeper truth of the Temple of Hatshepsut is the truth about what survives erasure and what does not. Thutmose III's destruction campaign removed Hatshepsut's name from her monuments. It smashed her statues, it chiseled her face from the walls, it replaced her cartouches with those of her male predecessors, and for 3,000 years the campaign succeeded. Hatshepsut was forgotten. Her temple was attributed to other pharaohs. Her existence was unknown to the modern world until the mid-19th century, when careful epigraphic work revealed the presence of a female pharaoh in the 18th dynasty succession. But the temple survived. The three terraces still rose against the cliff. The colonnades still framed the approach. The ramps still connected the levels. The proportions still harmonized with the landscape. Everything that made Djeser exceptional, its architecture, its setting, its relationship to the cliff, was untouched by the erasure. Thutmose removed the name. He left the building, And the building, in the end, proved more durable than the name. The name was recovered, painstakingly, through epigraphic detective work over more than a century. The building never needed to be recovered. It was always there, always visible, always beautiful. And its beauty was the thing that the erasure could not touch. Because beauty is a quality of form, not of inscription. You can erase a cartouche. You cannot erase a proportion. You can smash a statue. You cannot smash the relationship between a terrace and a cliff. The building survives because the things that make it great are the things that no chisel can reach. Let that sink in. The most famous erasure in Egyptian history, the systematic destruction of a female pharaoh's legacy by her male successor, failed, not because the destruction was incomplete, although it was, not because the evidence was recovered, although it was, but because the thing that the destruction was trying to erase, the memory of Hatshepsut, was encoded not in inscriptions, which can be chiseled away, but in architecture, which cannot. The temple is the memory. The terraces are the memory. The colonnades are the memory. The ramps, the proportions, the alignment with the cliff, the orientation toward the sunrise. These are the memory. They are Hatshepsut's memory, her vision, her ambition, her taste, her theological program, her political statement, encoded in stone, in space, in the relationship between building and landscape, and no amount of name chiseling can touch them. This is the paradox of erasure that the Temple of Hatshepsut reveals. Erasure works on names. It does not work on architecture. Erasure works on inscriptions. It does not work on proportions. Erasure can remove the text from a building. It cannot remove the building from the landscape. And the landscape, the cliff, the amphitheatre, the three terraces rising against the rock, speaks more eloquently about Hatshepsut than any cartouche ever could. The 1997 massacre at Deir el-Bahari, when gunmen killed 58 tourists and 4 Egyptians near the temple, added a modern layer of tragedy to the site's already layered history. The attack, carried out by members of an Islamist militant group, targeted the tourist economy that sustains the local community. The massacre was followed by a period of drastically reduced tourism that affected the entire Luxor region. The temple, which had been a symbol of ancient power and beauty, became temporarily associated with modern violence. But the association faded, the tourists returned, the temple endured. And the memory of the attack, while not forgotten, is now one layer among many in the long history of a site that has absorbed pharaonic construction, royal destruction, Christian occupation, Islamic reuse, archaeological excavation, Polish restoration, and the daily visitation of thousands of people from every country on earth. The temple absorbs, that is its nature. It absorbs the cliff behind it. It absorbs the sunlight that enters its sanctuary. It absorbs the history that accretes on its walls. Egyptian, Christian, modern. It absorbs the tourists who walk its ramps. It absorbs the scholars who study its inscriptions. And it absorbs the memory of the woman who built it, a memory that was once erased and that has now been restored, not by chiseling her name back onto the walls, but by telling her story to anyone who will listen. The story of Hatshepsut is, in the 21st century, more widely known than at any point since her death. Books, documentaries, museum exhibitions, and archaeological publications have brought her reign to a global audience. The discovery of her possible mummy, identified in 2007 through DNA analysis, and a dental match with a molar found in a canopic box bearing her name, added a physical dimension to the historical record. And the temple at Deir el-Bahari, visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year, stands as the most visible and most powerful testament to her achievement. The erasure is part of the story now. It is not a gap in the record. It is a chapter in the record. The chapter about what happens when power is used to suppress memory, and about the limits of that suppression. The erasure tells us about Thutmose III's political anxieties. The survival of the temple tells us about the limits of those anxieties, and the recovery of Hatshepsut's name, through the patient, accumulating work of generations of scholars, tells us about the power of evidence to outlast the power of destruction. The 1997 attack at Deir el-Bahari, which claimed the lives of 58 tourists and 4 Egyptians, remains one of the darkest moments in the modern history of Egyptian tourism. The attack occurred on November 17th, when a group of armed militants descended from the cliffs above the temple and opened fire on visitors in the forecourt. The victims came from Switzerland, Japan, Germany, France, Britain, Colombia, and Egypt. They had come to see the temple of a woman who ruled 3,400 years ago, and they died in the shadow of her colonnades. The attack devastated the Luxor tourism industry. Visitor numbers plummeted, hotels emptied. The economic consequences for the local community, which depends almost entirely on tourism for its livelihood, were severe and lasted for years. The Egyptian government responded with increased security measures, including armed guards at all major archaeological sites, and the tourism industry eventually recovered. But the memory of the attack remains, a modern layer of violence inscribed on a site that has already absorbed 34 centuries of construction, destruction, and transformation. The contrast between the temple's ancient purpose and the modern violence that occurred there is jarring. The temple was built to ensure the eternal life of a pharaoh, to guarantee that the deceased king would be reborn with the rising sun, sustained by the offerings of the priests, protected by the gods whose chapels lined the terraces. The temple was a place of renewal, of rebirth, of the triumph of order over chaos. The attack inverted these themes, bringing death to a place of eternal life, chaos to a place of cosmic order, violence to a place of divine peace. But the temple absorbed the attack as it has absorbed everything else. The bullet holes were repaired, the bloodstains were cleaned, the security barriers were installed, and the visitors returned, drawn by the same beauty, the same history, the same sense of wonder that had drawn the victims of the attack. The temple endures because the things that make it valuable are the things that violence cannot destroy. Its proportions, its setting, its relationship to the cliff, the quality of its art, the depth of its history. These are not targets. They are not vulnerable to bullets. They are vulnerable only to time and to neglect. And time and neglect, while slower than bullets, are ultimately more destructive. The ongoing conservation challenge at Deir el-Bahari is the challenge of maintaining a 3,400-year-old sandstone building in a climate that is simultaneously too dry and too variable. The daily temperature range in the Theban hills can exceed 30 degrees Celsius, from near freezing before dawn to above 40 degrees in the afternoon. This thermal cycling causes the outer layers of the sandstone to expand and contract at different rates, producing stresses that eventually cause the stone to flake, crack, and spall. The painted plaster that covers the carved surfaces is especially vulnerable. The differential expansion between the plaster and the underlying stone causes the plaster to detach, carrying the painted decoration with it. The Polish mission has addressed this challenge with a combination of physical conservation and documentation. Where the painted surfaces are stable, they are left in place and protected with transparent consolidating agents that penetrate the plaster and anchor it to the stone. Where the surfaces are actively deteriorating, they are documented photographically before any intervention is attempted, ensuring that the information contained in the paint is preserved, even if the physical surface is eventually lost. The documentation is, in a sense, the most important product of the conservation program. The physical surfaces will eventually deteriorate. No conservation treatment can arrest the thermodynamic processes that are slowly destroying the sandstone and its painted decoration. But the documentation can be preserved indefinitely, in published volumes, in digital archives, in photographic collections that capture the current state of the surfaces with a precision that will allow future scholars to study details that may be invisible to the naked eye in a century. And the surfaces contain information that we have not yet fully extracted. The painted reliefs in the Punt colonnade, for example, contain details about the flora, fauna, and geography of the Land of Punt that have not been fully catalogued or analysed. The depictions of fish species, tree species, and architectural styles may provide clues to the precise location of Punt, a question that remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of Egyptology. The most recent scholarship places Punt in the region of modern Eritrea or eastern Sudan, but the identification is not certain, and the Deir el-Bahari reliefs remain the most important body of evidence available. The divine birth reliefs on the northern colonnade of the middle terrace present their own set of interpretive challenges. The narrative sequence from the divine council to the birth of the pharaoh, is conventional in its broad outlines, following the same template that would later be used by Amenhotep III in his birth room at Luxor Temple. But the specific details of the Deir el-Bahari version are unique. The conception scene, in which Amun visits Queen Ahmose in the guise of Thutmose I, is rendered with a delicacy and a specificity that reflects the particular urgency of Hatshepsut's legitimacy claim. The scene is not merely an assertion of divine parentage, it is an argument, a carefully constructed theological case for the legitimacy of a female king, presented in visual form on the walls of the temple that was designed to house that argument for eternity. The argument runs as follows. Amun chose Ahmose. Amun fathered Hatshepsut. The child was divine from the moment of conception. The gender of the child was irrelevant because the divine essence that animated the child was the essence of a god, not of a man or a woman. Hatshepsut was not a woman who became king. She was a divine being who happened to inhabit a female body, a body that was, in theological terms, merely a container for the divine Ka that Amun had placed within it. The birth narrative resolved the theological contradiction of female kingship by dissolving the category of gender altogether. Hatshepsut was not male or female, she was divine, and the divine, being beyond human categories, was beyond gender. This theological argument, presented in visual form on the walls of the temple, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of political propaganda in the ancient world. It does not merely assert Hatshepsut's legitimacy. It provides a theoretical framework for understanding female kingship, a framework that is logically consistent, theologically grounded, and architecturally permanent. The argument is carved in stone. It cannot be refuted. It can only be chiseled away. And even the chiseling, the erasure that Thutmose III later imposed, did not fully destroy the argument. The outline of the scenes is still visible. The captions are still partially readable. The sequence of events can still be reconstructed from the surviving traces. The argument survives, in fragmentary form, on the walls of the temple that was built to house it, and the fragments, painstakingly documented by the Polish mission and by earlier scholars, are sufficient to reconstruct the argument in its entirety. The birth narrative at Deir el-Bahari is not just a decoration, it is a constitutional document, the theological equivalent of a founding charter, a declaration of legitimacy, a bill of rights for a female pharaoh. And the temple that contains it is not just a building. It is a courthouse, the place where the case for Hatshepsut's kingship was presented, argued and, despite the best efforts of her successor, permanently recorded. The case has been heard. The verdict, 3,400 years later, is in. Hatshepsut was a legitimate king. Her temple says so, her art says so, her trade expedition says so, her divine birth says so, and the cliff at Deir el-Bahari, which holds the temple against its face with the patience of geology, says so too. The significance of Dorman's 20-year delay theory cannot be overstated because it transforms the entire narrative of Hatshepsut's erasure from a story of personal revenge to a story of institutional pragmatism. If the erasure had been immediate, if Thutmose III had ordered the destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments on the day he became sole ruler, the personal vendetta interpretation would be compelling. An immediate erasure would suggest fury, resentment, the explosive release of decades of frustration. But a 20-year delay suggests something entirely different. It suggests calculation, planning, strategic thinking. The erasure was not a reaction, it was a policy, and the policy had a specific political context. In the last decade of Thutmose III's reign, the succession was on the agenda. His son, Amenhotep II, was being prepared for the throne, and the dynastic record needed to be clean, a straightforward sequence of male kings, with no anomalous female pharaoh complicating the lineage. The erasure was housekeeping. It was the ancient equivalent of editing a family tree, removing a figure whose presence in the record, while historically accurate, was politically inconvenient. This interpretation is supported by the nature of the erasure itself. Hatshepsut's cartouches were not simply removed, they were replaced, with the names of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, and Thutmose III. The replacement created a seamless male sequence: grandfather, father, son, in which no female pharaoh appeared. The erasure did not create a gap, it closed a gap. It was a repair, not a destruction, and the repair was carried out with a precision and a consistency that suggest institutional direction rather than individual rage. The incomplete nature of the erasure. The fact that some images were left untouched, some inscriptions were only partially defaced, some statues were damaged but not destroyed, has been interpreted in different ways by different scholars. Some see the incompleteness as evidence of haste. The destruction teams ran out of time or resources before they could finish the job. Others see it as evidence of selective targeting. Only the most visible and most theologically problematic images were removed, while less prominent ones were left in place. Still others see it as evidence of ambivalence. The destruction teams, or the officials who directed them, may have felt conflicted about erasing the memory of a ruler who had, by all accounts, governed competently and maintained the cosmic order for 20 years. The ambivalence interpretation is speculative but appealing. Hatshepsut had been a successful pharaoh. She had maintained Mat. She had built temples. She had honored the gods. She had not, as far as the evidence suggests, been a tyrannical or incompetent ruler. The officials who carried out the erasure may have recognized this. They may have felt that the erasure was necessary for political reasons but unjust in personal terms, and they may have expressed that ambivalence by doing the job less thoroughly than they could have. By leaving enough traces that a careful observer in a future century might be able to reconstruct what had been erased. If this interpretation is correct, then the erasure contains within itself the seeds of its own undoing. The destruction teams left enough evidence to allow the reconstruction of Hatshepsut's reign. Not immediately, not for 3,000 years, but eventually. The evidence was there, the traces were there, the fragments were there, and when the Egyptologists of the 19th and 20th centuries finally looked closely enough, the erased queen emerged from the palimpsest of her own destruction. Visible, identifiable, nameable, real. The temple at Deir el-Bahari is the primary document in this reconstruction. It is the place where the most evidence survived. It is the place where the most fragments were found. It is the place where the most traces of the original decoration can still be seen. In the outlines of chiseled cartouches, in the shapes of removed images, in the ghosts of erased inscriptions that are visible to the trained eye as subtle differences in the texture and colour of the stone. The temple is a document of its own destruction. The erasure is part of the architecture. The chiselling is part of the decoration. And the reading of the erasure, the detective work of identifying what was removed, when it was removed, and why, is one of the great intellectual achievements of modern Egyptology. Hatshepsut has become, in the 21st century, a figure of enormous cultural significance, a symbol of female leadership, of artistic patronage, of political courage, and of the resilience of memory against the forces of erasure. Her story has been told in books, documentaries, museum exhibitions, and university courses around the world. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has dedicated an entire gallery to her art. The temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of the most visited monuments in Egypt, and her name, Matkar, Truth is the Ka of Ra, is more widely known today than at any point since her death, 3,400 years ago. The irony is perfect. The erasure that was supposed to remove Hatshepsut from history has become the most famous thing about her. The story of her destruction is more compelling than the story of any pharaoh whose name was never touched. The erasure made her more interesting. The destruction made her more sympathetic. The attempt to silence her made her story louder. And the temple, the building that was supposed to guarantee her eternal memory, but that was targeted for destruction by her own successor, has become, precisely because of the destruction, the most eloquent memorial in Egypt. Not despite the erasure. Because of it, the erasure is part of the beauty. The chiseled cartouches, the smashed statues, the defaced reliefs, these are not flaws, they are features. They are evidence of a struggle between two wills. The will of a woman to be remembered, and the will of a man to make her be forgotten. The struggle was fought in stone, with chisels and hammers, across the surfaces of the most beautiful temple in Egypt, and the woman won. Not because her name survived on the walls. It was chiseled away. but because her building survived in the landscape. And the building, as we have seen, is the name. The building is the memory. The building is Hatshepsut, and the sunrise, entering the sanctuary each midwinter morning, confirms it. The light finds the shrine, the god acknowledges the king, and the king, the woman who was king, the king whose name was erased, the king whose building endures, receives the light in silence, in stone, in the Holy of Holies, in the most beautiful temple in Egypt, for another year, for another century, for as long as the cliff holds and the sun rises, and the proportions that Senenmutli designed catch the light at dawn and glow gold against the limestone, 3,400 years of beauty, undiminished, unerased, eternal. The temple's influence on subsequent Egyptian architecture, while debatable, is visible in the work of later builders who adopted elements of Senenmut's design. The terraced approach, the use of colonnades to frame the facade, and the integration of the building with its natural setting were all features that later architects admired, and, in some cases, emulated. Thutmose III himself built a small temple, Djeser Akhet, immediately adjacent to Hatshepsut's complex, using a similar terrace design. The location, directly above Hatshepsut's upper terrace, was a deliberate act of architectural one-upmanship. The stepson's temple rising above the stepmother's, claiming the higher ground, asserting the superiority of the male line. But the design vocabulary, the terraces, the colonnades, the integration with the cliff, was borrowed directly from the building it was meant to surpass. The 18th dynasty produced other temples that show the influence of Deir el-Bahari, the terraced temple of Hathor at Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai, the rock-cut shrines of Nubia, and the formal gardens that were incorporated into later temple designs. The concept of landscape integration, of designing a building to work with its natural setting rather than against it, was not invented at Deir el-Bahari, but it was perfected there, and the perfection influenced every subsequent generation of Egyptian architects who visited the site and studied its proportions. The modern architectural profession has also recognized the significance of Djeser Djeseru. The building has been cited in architectural histories, design textbooks, and professional journals as an early example of contextual design, the practice of designing a building in response to its specific site conditions, rather than imposing a generic design on any available location. The horizontal emphasis of the colonnades, the stepped massing of the terraces, the use of natural rock as a design element. These features anticipate design principles that were not formalized in Western architecture until the 20th century. Senenmut, working 34 centuries ago, produced a building that conforms to design principles that modern architects consider progressive. The comparison with modern contextual architecture highlights how far ahead of its time Djeser Djeseru was. Most ancient Egyptian temples were designed according to generic plans, rectangular enclosures, with pylons at the front, courts in the middle, and sanctuaries at the rear. The plan was standard, the site was secondary. But at Deir el-Bahari, the site came first. The cliff, the amphitheatre, the orientation, the light. These were the design parameters. The building was shaped to fit them. The result was a temple that could not have been built anywhere else. A building that belongs to its site so completely that removing it from the landscape would be unthinkable. You cannot move Djeser Djeseru. It is the cliff. It is the amphitheatre. It is the Theban landscape, shaped by human hands into something divine. And this rootedness, this inseparability of building and site, is what makes the Temple of Hatshepsut the opposite of the monuments that were relocated from the Nile Valley during the Aswan Dam salvage campaign. Abu Simbel was cut into blocks and moved. The Temple of Dendur was shipped to New York. The Temple of Debo was sent to Madrid. These monuments survived because they were movable, because they could be separated from their geological context and reassembled elsewhere. Djeser Djeseru is not movable. It is carved into the cliff. It is integrated with the amphitheatre. It is calibrated to the light, the acoustics, the visual rhythms of a specific landscape. It cannot be cut into blocks. It cannot be shipped to a museum. It can only exist where it exists. At the base of the cliff at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Karnak, facing the sunrise, holding the memory of a woman who was king, and the memory, the specific architectural, proportional, landscape-integrated memory that the temple holds is the memory that the erasure could not erase. Thutmose III's chisels could remove a name. They could not remove a terrace. They could not remove a ramp. They could not remove the proportional relationship between the colonnade and the cliff, between the horizontal of the building and the vertical of the rock, between the geometric precision of the architecture and the geological randomness of the landscape. These relationships are the temple's deepest code, its most essential information, its truest memory of its creator, and they survive, intact, legible, beautiful, 34 centuries after the creator's name was chiseled from the walls. The temple remembers Hatshepsut, not through her name, which was erased, not through her statues, which were smashed, not through her inscriptions, which were defaced, but through her architecture, through the 3 terraces, the 2 ramps, the multiple colonnades, the integrated gardens, the solar-aligned sanctuary, the cliff-embracing design that no pharaoh before her had conceived and that no pharaoh after her would equal. The architecture is the memory, the proportions are the name, and the building, rising in the morning light against the Theban cliff, says what no cartouche needed to say. I am here. I built this. I was king. Remember me. 3,400 years. The cliff remembers. The temple remembers. The sunrise remembers. And now, after the long silence of the erasure, the world remembers too. Stand on the upper terrace of Djeser Djeseru and look east. The view is one of the most dramatic in Egypt. Across the Nile Valley, over the green strip of cultivation, past the river, to the temples of Karnak and Luxor on the eastern bank, the 2 shores of the Nile, the east bank of the living and the west bank of the dead, are both visible from this vantage point. The living world and the world of the dead, connected by the river, framed by the temple, held in a single field of vision. This was the view that Hatshepsut designed. She chose the site, the orientation, the height. She positioned the temple so that anyone standing on the upper terrace would see the full extent of the Theban landscape, the city of the living on the east bank, the city of the dead on the west, and the river that separated them. The temple was not merely a building. It was a viewpoint, a position from which the entire cosmos of Theban theology could be apprehended in a single gaze. And the architecture of the temple was designed to frame this view. The colonnades, with their open fronts facing east, channeled the visitor's gaze outward toward the valley. The ramps, ascending from terrace to terrace, raised the viewer's vantage point with each level, expanding the vista progressively. From the forecourt, where only the immediate surroundings were visible, to the upper terrace, where the entire valley opened up. The ascent was not merely physical, it was perceptual. Each level offered a wider view, a broader perspective, a more comprehensive vision of the world that the temple was designed to mediate. This integration of architecture and landscape is what makes Djeser Djeseru unique. Egyptian temples were typically enclosed spaces, walls, pylons, and columns creating dark interiors focused inward, toward the sanctuary, away from the world outside. Djeser Djeseru reverses this relationship. It opens outward. It embraces the landscape. It uses the cliff as a backdrop and the valley as a foreground. It is, in architectural terms, an amphitheatre, a building designed not to contain space, but to frame it. The influence of this design on later architecture is difficult to prove, but easy to imagine. When European travellers first saw Djeser Djeseru in the 19th century, they were struck by the resemblance between Hatshepsut's colonnades and the colonnaded facades of classical Greek architecture, the proto-Doric columns of the lower terrace, square pillars with simple capitals resembling the earliest Greek Doric columns, seem to anticipate by 1,000 years the architectural language of the Parthenon. The resemblance may be coincidental. There is no direct evidence of Egyptian influence on early Greek architecture, although contact between the 2 cultures is well documented from the 7th century BC onward. But the visual similarity is striking, and the possibility that Egyptian temple architecture contributed, however indirectly, to the development of the Greek orders remains a tantalizing hypothesis. Whether or not the Greeks learned from Hatshepsut, the modern world has. Djeser Djeseru is now recognized as one of the masterpieces of world architecture, a building that transcends its cultural context and speaks to universal principles of design, the integration of building and landscape, the use of horizontal lines to echo geological strata, the progression from public to private, from light to dark, from exterior to interior. These principles are not Egyptian, they are architectural. They apply to any building, in any culture, in any century. And they were articulated at Deir el-Bahari 34 centuries ago by a woman who was later erased from history and by an architect who may have been her lover. The irony is precise. The most forward-looking building in Egyptian architecture was built by a ruler whom later generations tried to forget. The most innovative temple in the Theban necropolis was the one whose builder's name was chiseled from its walls. The building that has inspired more architectural admiration than any other Egyptian monument is the one that was supposed to be anonymous, the one whose patron was supposed to have been erased, whose architect was supposed to have been forgotten, whose very existence was supposed to have been absorbed into the undifferentiated record of male pharaonic succession. The erasure failed, the building won. And Hatshepsut, the woman who became king, the king who built the most beautiful temple in Egypt, the ruler whose name was taken from her but whose architecture could not be, is remembered, not because her name survived on the walls, because her building survived in the landscape, because the 3 terraces still rise against the cliff, because the colonnades still frame the valley, because the proportions still harmonize with the rock, because the temple, 3,400 years after its construction, is still the most beautiful thing on the west bank of the Nile. The name can be erased, the beauty cannot, and the beauty in the end is the truest memorial. Senenmut's hidden portraits within the temple tell a story within the story of a commoner who rose to the highest levels of Egyptian society through talent, ambition, and the patronage of a queen. Senenmut was not born to the aristocracy. His parents were modest people. Their names, Ramos and Hatnofer, are preserved in inscriptions, but their titles are those of minor provincial officials, not of the court elite. Senenmut rose through the ranks of the 18th dynasty bureaucracy to become the most powerful, non-royal person in Egypt, holding simultaneously the positions of chief steward of Amun, overseer of all royal works, and tutor to the royal princess Neferura, Hatshepsut's only daughter. His relationship with Hatshepsut has been the subject of centuries of speculation. Crude graffiti found in a quarry near Deir el-Bahari depicts a male figure in a sexual position behind a figure wearing royal regalia, an image that some scholars have interpreted as a satirical depiction of Senenmut and Hatshepsut. The interpretation is contested. The graffiti may depict entirely different individuals, or it may be a generic piece of vulgar humour with no specific referent. But the speculation persists because Senenmut's position was so anomalous. He was a commoner in a royal world. He held powers that were normally reserved for members of the royal family. He was permitted to place his own image inside the Queen's temple, and he prepared a secret tomb, TT 353, directly beneath the temple forecourt, in a location that would have been, in theological terms, within the sacred space of the Queen's own mortuary complex. The astronomical ceiling of TT 353 is one of the most remarkable objects in Egyptian art. It depicts the northern sky with the constellations of the circumpolar stars, the southern sky with the decans, the 36 star groups that the Egyptians used to track the passage of the night hours, and a lunar calendar that records the months and their associated festivals. The ceiling is the earliest known astronomical diagram from Egypt, predating the more famous astronomical ceilings of the Ramesside tombs by several centuries. It suggests that Senenmut had knowledge of, or access to specialists in, astronomical observation, knowledge that may have been applied to the design of the temple's solar alignment. The fall of Senenmut, if fall it was, is as mysterious as his rise. He disappears from the historical record around the 16th year of Hatshepsut's reign, roughly 4 years before the Queen's death. His name was defaced in some of his monuments. His images were partially destroyed. The pattern is similar to, though less complete than, the erasure that would later be directed at Hatshepsut herself. Did Senenmut fall from favour before Hatshepsut died? Was he punished for overreaching? For the secret tomb? For the hidden images? For the presumption of a commoner who dared to place himself in the sacred space of the king? Or did he simply die of natural causes at a time that happened to coincide with a shift in political fortunes that made his memory inconvenient? The questions are unanswerable with the evidence currently available, but they add a dimension of human drama to the architectural program of Deir el-Bahari. The temple was not designed by an abstraction. It was designed by a man with ambitions, vulnerabilities, relationships, and a fate that the historical record cannot fully reveal. The hidden portraits within the temple are, in a sense, Senenmut's autobiography, his attempt to write himself into the sacred narrative, to claim a place in the eternity that the temple was designed to provide. The fact that the portraits were hidden, placed behind doors, beneath windowsills, in locations that would be invisible to casual observers, suggests that Senenmut knew the portraits were transgressive. He was inserting himself into a space that did not belong to him, and he was doing it secretly, hoping that the concealment would protect the images from the destruction that his presumption might provoke. The concealment worked. The hidden portraits survived, discovered by archaeologists, documented in scholarly publications, now among the most famous examples of personal ambition in ancient Egyptian art. Senenmut's secret autobiography, written in carved stone in the interstices of the Queen's Temple, has outlasted the erasure that destroyed his more prominent monuments. The man who hid his face behind doors has been found. The commoner who dared to love a queen, if love it was, has been remembered, and the temple that he designed, the most beautiful building in Egypt, bears his signature in 60 hidden places that the destroyers never found. The temple at Deir el-Bahari has also served as a setting for modern archaeological discoveries that have nothing to do with Hatshepsut herself. The cliffs above and below the temple contain tombs from multiple periods: Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Third Intermediate Period, and later, and the temple's forecourt and surrounding areas have yielded burials, caches, and artifacts from across the full span of Theban history. The most famous of these discoveries is the Deir el-Bahari Royal Cache, TT320, or DB320, discovered in 1881 and in a shaft tomb in the cliffs south of the temple. The cache contained the mummies of more than 50 royal and priestly individuals, including the mummies of Ramesses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, Ahmose, and Amenhotep I. These mummies had been gathered from their original tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the 21st dynasty, and reburied in the cache to protect them from tomb robbers. The discovery of the cache, made possible by the local Abd el-Rasul family, who had been secretly selling artifacts from the cache for several years before the authorities became aware of its existence, was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of Egyptology. The cache has no direct connection to Hatshepsut's temple. It is located in a separate tomb, in a different part of the Deir el-Bahari complex, but its proximity to the temple and its association with the same cliff face, the same sacred landscape, the same necropolis, means that the stories are often told together. Deir el-Bahari is not just the site of Hatshepsut's temple. It is the site where the royal mummies were hidden. It is the site where Mentuhotep II built the prototype for Hatshepsut's design. It is the site where the Polish mission has been working for more than 60 years. It is a place where 34 centuries of Theban history are compressed into a single cliff face, a vertical archive of burial, worship, destruction, preservation, and rediscovery. And the cliff itself, the towering wall of limestone that forms the backdrop to the temple, that rises 300 meters above the valley floor, that glows pink at dawn and gold at sunset, is the ultimate constant. The cliff was there before Mentuhotep, before Hatshepsut, before the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the Old Kingdom. The cliff was there before Egypt. It is a geological formation, laid down in the Eocene, eroded by millennia of rare but violent floods, sculpted by wind and temperature into the amphitheatre that Senenmut saw and recognized as the perfect setting for his masterwork. The cliff will be there after us, after the tourists and the conservators and the archaeologists, after the temple itself has crumbled, which it will, eventually, no matter how carefully it is maintained. The sandstone will erode, the columns will fall, the terraces will collapse, The painted surfaces will fade to nothing, and the cliff will remain, holding the memory of the temple in its shape, in the ledges where the terraces once rested, in the cut marks where the sanctuary was carved into the rock. The cliff will remember the temple long after the temple has forgotten itself. And in that remembering, that geological remembering, that memory of stone holding the shape of a vanished building, there is a final echo of Hatshepsut's story, the queen who was erased, the temple that survived, the cliff that remembers, each one holding a piece of the story, each one outlasting the others in turn, name, building, mountain, each one a different kind of permanence, each one eventually yielding to a larger and longer duration. The name lasted 3,000 years before it was chiseled away. The building has lasted 3,400 years so far. The cliff will last millions. And the story of a woman who became king, who built a temple, who was erased, who was remembered. The story has no expiration date at all, because stories, unlike names and buildings and cliffs, are carried not in stone but in minds. And minds, unlike stone, can reproduce themselves, can pass their contents from one generation to the next, can carry a story across 34 centuries without losing a syllable. The cliff holds the temple holds the reliefs hold the story, and the story holds Hatshepsut, the woman who became king, the king who built the most beautiful temple in Egypt, the ruler whose name was erased but whose building endures. She is there, in the three terraces, in the cliff, in the sunrise, in every visitor who stands at the base of the first ramp and looks up and feels, without needing to be told, that something extraordinary happened here, something that the stone remembers, something that the cliff holds, something that the sunrise, entering the sanctuary each midwinter morning, confirms. She was here, she built this, she was king. And the temple, her temple, the Holy of Holies, the most beautiful building in Egypt, is her proof. Enden, the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, the bank where Deir el-Bahari stands, where the Valley of the Kings hides its royal tombs, where the Colossi of Memnon stand guard over the ruined mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, is the single most concentrated landscape of funerary architecture in the world. Within an area of roughly 10 square kilometers, dozens of mortuary temples, hundreds of tombs, and thousands of individual burials span more than 2,000 years of Egyptian history. The landscape is layered. Every square meter of ground has been dug, built upon, abandoned, reused, and dug again. Every cliff face has been carved, every valley explored, every ridge surveyed by generation after generation of priests, builders, tomb robbers, and archaeologists. In this crowded landscape, the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari occupies a position of unique visual prominence. The natural amphitheatre of the cliff, a bay in the rock face, roughly 500 meters wide and 100 meters deep, with walls that rise vertically to a height of 300 meters, creates a natural stage on which the temple is the principal performer. No other mortuary temple on the West Bank has this kind of setting. The Ramesseum, Ramesses II's mortuary temple, sits on flat ground near the cultivation. The temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu is enclosed by high walls that block the landscape. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, once the largest in Egypt, has been reduced to the two colossi and a few scattered foundations. Only Deir el-Bahari combines monumental architecture with monumental landscape in a way that makes the building and the setting inseparable. The acoustic properties of the amphitheatre are also significant. The cliff walls reflect and amplify sound, creating a natural echo chamber that would have given the chanting of priests and the music of temple ceremonies a resonance and a grandeur that flat-ground temples could not match. The effect is still perceptible to modern visitors. A voice raised in the forecourt of the temple is reflected by the cliff and returned, slightly amplified, with a slight delay. The acoustic effect is not dramatic. It does not produce a thunderous echo, but it is present, and it would have been noted by the original builders, who were attentive to the sensory dimensions of temple architecture in a way that modern visitors sometimes overlook. The visual effect of the temple is also dependent on time of day. In the early morning, when the sun is low in the east, the facade of the temple is fully illuminated. The columns cast long shadows, the colors glow, the proportions are sharpest. By midday, when the sun is directly overhead, The facade is in partial shade. The overhanging cliff blocks the direct sunlight, and the temple retreats into the shadow of the mountain. In the late afternoon, the cliff face behind the temple catches the western light and glows pink and gold, a natural backdrop that changes color with the minutes, turning from warm amber to deep rose to purple as the sun descends. The temple, standing against this changing backdrop, changes appearance with it. A building that looks different at every hour, that reveals different details in different lights, that is never quite the same twice. This responsiveness to light, this capacity to change appearance with the time of day and the season of the year, is one of the qualities that makes Djeser Djeseru so compelling to modern visitors and so difficult to photograph. A photograph captures a single moment. The temple exists in continuous time. The experience of the building is the experience of watching it change, of seeing the shadows move across the facade, of watching the cliff change color behind it, of feeling the temperature shift as the sun moves from east to west, and the cool of the morning gives way to the heat of the afternoon. Senenmut, the architect, would have understood these effects. He would have visited the site at every hour of the day, in every season, watching how the light fell, how the shadows moved, how the cliff changed color. He would have chosen the proportions of his building, the height of the testers, spacing of the columns, the width of the ramps, to work with the light, not against it. The building is calibrated to its environment in a way that only prolonged observation could achieve. It is the work of a man who spent years studying the site before picking up a chisel. The temple is not merely built on the landscape, it is designed for it. The relationship between the temple and the Valley of the Kings, which lies on the other side of the cliff ridge, is also significant. The Valley of the Kings, where Hatshepsut's tomb, KV20, was cut into the rock, is accessible from Deir el-Bahari by a steep path that crosses the cliff ridge at the saddle between the two valleys. This path, used by ancient priests and modern archaeologists alike, connects the two most sacred spaces in the Theban necropolis: the valley where the kings were buried and the amphitheatre where their mortuary temples stood. The connection is not merely geographical, it is theological. The temple on the east side of the cliff is where the living performed the rituals. The tomb on the west side is where the dead received them. And the cliff itself, the massive limestone barrier that separates the two spaces, is the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the threshold that the deceased king must cross to reach the afterlife. Hatshepsut chose to locate her tomb directly behind her temple, on the far side of the cliff, in the Valley of the Kings, on an axis that extends the temple's east-west alignment westward into the mountain. The tomb entrance, KV20, is one of the deepest in the Valley of the Kings. Its corridors descend more than 97 meters below the surface and extend more than 200 meters into the rock. The tomb was originally designed for Hatshepsut and her father, Thutmose I, whose mummy she intended to rebury in the deepest chamber of the tomb. The plan was theological. By uniting her burial with her father's, Hatshepsut was reinforcing the legitimacy claim that the temple's birth narrative had established. She was the daughter of Thutmose I. She was buried beside him. The claim was carved in stone at the temple and confirmed in rock at the tomb. The tomb was robbed in antiquity. The mummies were removed during the Third Intermediate Period and stored in the Great Royal Cache at DB 320, where they were rediscovered in 1881. The tomb is now empty, a long, descending corridor, decorated with a simple star pattern on its ceiling, leading to two burial chambers that contain nothing but the red quartzite sarcophagus of Hatshepsut and the yellow quartzite sarcophagus that she had prepared for her father. The sarcophagi are empty, the grave goods are gone, the mummies are in museums, and the tomb, like the temple, has been stripped of its contents but not of its meaning, because the meaning of the tomb, like the meaning of the temple, is in the architecture, in the depth of the corridors, in the alignment of the axis, in the relationship between the temple on one side of the cliff and the tomb on the other. The architecture says, this is a king lies here, a king whose temple faces the sunrise on the east side of the mountain, whose tomb descends into the darkness on the west side, whose afterlife is bounded by the cliff that separates the living from the dead. The architecture says what the inscriptions can no longer say, because the inscriptions have been chiseled away. But the architecture remains. The corridors remain. The sarcophagi remain. And the axis. The long straight line that connects the temple's sanctuary to the tomb's deepest chamber, passing through the mountain, through the cliff, through the boundary between the living and the dead, remains as well. Unbroken, unalterable, permanent. The axis is Hatshepsut's final statement. It connects the place of worship to the place of burial, the place of sunrise to the place of descent, the world of the living to the world of the dead. It is a line drawn through stone, a line that the erasure could not touch, that the tomb robbers could not break, that 34 centuries of time could not bend. It is the straightest, the longest, and the most permanent thing that Hatshepsut built. And it still runs true, from the temple to the tomb, from the sunrise to the darkness, from the world that remembers her to the world that holds her bones. So what is the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari? It is Jezeru, the Holy of Holies, the mortuary temple of the woman who became pharaoh. It was built around 1479 BC and took 15 years to complete. It was designed by Senenmut, the architect, who may have been the queen's closest confidant. It rises in 3 terraces against a limestone cliff on the west bank of the Nile, facing the sunrise, facing the temples of Karnak and Luxor across the river, facing the living world from the realm of the dead. Its walls once told the story of a divine birth. Amun visiting the queen's bedchamber, the infant king fashioned on a potter's wheel, the newborn recognized as the child of a god. Its walls once told the story of an expedition to the ends of the earth. 5 ships sailing to Punt, returning with myrrh trees and gold and baboons and the fragrance of incense. Its walls once bore the name of the woman who commissioned all of it. Matkar, truth is the Ka of Ra, a name that was later chiseled away, replaced, erased. The name was erased. The building was not. And the building, standing against its cliff, harmonizing with its landscape, rising in its 3 measured terraces toward the sky, has proven more durable than the erasure, more durable than the name, more durable than the politics that tried to suppress it, more durable even than the religion that gave it meaning. The priests of Amun are gone. The Punt expedition is a memory. The divine birth narrative is a scholarly reconstruction. But the temple stands, the terraces rise, the colonnades catch the light, and the cliff, which has been there for millions of years and will be there for millions more, holds the temple against its face with the patience of geology. Hatshepsut built for eternity, the eternity she imagined, an eternity of ritual, of priestly service, of perpetual offerings, did not materialize. The rituals stopped, the priests left, the offerings ceased. But a different eternity took its place, the eternity of architecture, the eternity of proportion, the eternity of a building so perfectly designed, so perfectly placed, so perfectly integrated with its landscape, that it transcends the culture that created it and speaks, directly and without translation, to anyone who sees it. The woman who built this temple had her name taken from her. The architect who designed it had his name defaced. The statues that adorned it were smashed and buried, and still the temple stands. Still the terraces rise. Still the colonnades frame the valley. Still the cliff holds the building against its face. Still the sunrise enters the sanctuary. Still the myrrh tree pits mark the forecourt, empty now but eloquent. The erasure removed the name. It could not remove the architecture, and the architecture, in the end, is the name. The building is Hatshepsut. The terraces are Hatshepsut. The proportions are Hatshepsut. Every column, every ramp, every carefully calculated angle between stone and cliff is Hatshepsut. The erasure took the cartouche. The building kept the queen. Visit Deir el-Bahari at dawn, when the cliff glows pink, and the terraces catch the first light, and the temple emerges from the darkness of the western bank like something being born. Stand at the base of the first ramp and look up. 3 levels, 3 terraces, 3,400 years, and a woman who would not be erased. The temple is her name, the cliff is her monument, and the sunrise, entering the sanctuary each midwinter morning, is the god acknowledging, once more, that the child he fathered is still here. Still present, still divine, still, after everything that was done to erase her, still stubbornly, magnificently, eternally, the king.